All right.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Hey, this is Johnny Lee with Peace at Work and the e-panic button. I want to thank everyone who jumped in early, and I know there's going to be a bunch more folks starting off, but we'll be starting right on time. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And on the caller in the meeting as well is Dr. Steve Albrecht. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Johnny. Thanks, everybody.
I'm looking forward to this a lot. I know we were just saying it before we were just arrange some technical things that sadly enough it's been active, it's been busy lately regarding the work that we do. One article I got to read, I just pulled it up and I got to read it. There was a headline about, according to the FBI tracking of the active shooter incidents, that it's tripled in the past few years. Again, I got to read that beyond the headline, but I'm curious to see if those figures are actually that high. I hate to think that they are.
I saw that too, and it is disturbing.
Mm-hmm. Golly, I know we can just jump into a conversation right now, but one of the things I have trouble with is the definitions of mass shooter. That I've seen some that's saying up to 3 victims or 4 victims, and I think sometimes, like the Clackamas Mall shooting, I believe he was capable of killing many more people before he was stopped. So, I would consider that one of the mass shooters, but it doesn't fit that criteria. So, it's a challenge, defining what a mass shooter is.
And I think the issue too is different statistics seem to skew the final numbers, and then it sort of either maximizes the problem or minimizes the problem, which is neither of those is good.
Right. That's right. I see it's just about the time, and I know I want to give the most amount of time to this presentation. Roughly, it's just going to go for about an hour, and generally we're asking if questions could be towards the end. Those of you who've joined us before or used GoToMeeting, you'll see a questions tab, and you could put that in. I'll be reviewing it along the way, but if it's something pertinent to the conversation, we may interrupt, but otherwise we'll have questions at the end. And the one thing I just want to say is I'm very, very glad to be doing this with Dr. Steve Albrecht. We met, I can't even think when we met, years and years ago, but I know we've contacted each other on phone and emailing and LinkedIn conversations. The one thing I just want to say I'm very excited about is your reputation. I'm not just hamming you up here. People do know you. I've certainly heard people referring to you in our field. You're based out of California. You've been doing this work for a long time. It was, 20 years ago when you wrote Ticking Bombs, Defusing Violence in the Workplace, interviewing a person who actually committed the murders, and you can really get a deeper look into it. You do have quite a bit of education as well, having a doctorate in business administration as well. I know there's a few things you want to mention, but the thing I want to say is I do a lot of these webinars, a lot of 101 and introducing things to people maybe in another field. I'm personally excited about this because I feel it's an advanced course by someone who certainly could handle that. So please, I'm just going to pass on over to you. If anything you want to say about yourself or the topic, it's on you now.
Thanks very much, Johnny, and good afternoon, everybody. And for my West Coast people, good morning. I just was in D.C. Last week, and we were talking a lot about the Navy Yard shooting, which is a tremendous tragedy and will continue to resonate and echo throughout the federal government, especially as they look at how they bring in subcontractors, how they supervise subcontractors, and then some of the mid-career background check issues, which I think is a constant struggle in our business, which is how do you identify problematic performance or behavior issues in employees that don't violate their rights as an employee. And in the public sector, we have a lot more challenges in that area than in the private sector. I've known Johnny for many years, and he's a great man and a hard worker in his field. I really rely a lot on his statistical work and the cases and the reports, especially in things that I don't think get a lot of coverage, like domestic violence in the workplace. Johnny is really spot on in terms of his knowledge of these incidents around the country, and I look forward to his emails. I look forward to his reports. I go to his website to get an update of a lot of things that happen in our work. Johnny and I met, I think, back in the late 90s would be, or early 2000s would be the NIOSH, National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health Conference in Baltimore.
That's it. That was it. You're right.
So thanks to Johnny for having me. My claim to fame, if it is one, is I wrote one of the first books on workplace violence back in 1994. The book was called Ticking Bombs. I wrote the book with a psychologist, Dr. Michael Mantell. At the time, Mantell was the police psychologist in city of San Diego, PD. That's where I knew him when I was a cop in San Diego. And Mantell had been involved in the biggest massacre, workplace violence massacre in the United States at that time, which was the McDonald's shooting in 1984. And I was actually in the academy about 8 whole days when James Huberty went into the McDonald's in San Diego, in the last U.S. city before you cross into Mexico, which is called San Ysidro. And he killed 21 people. And that was the worst thing I ever saw in my police career, and all I ever looked at was the photographs, the Polaroids of 21 dead kids and their parents. So that was my introduction to the subject. I stayed with the PD from 84 to 99. And in 1992, there was a case in San Diego where Robert Mack, an employee of General Dynamics, killed 2 people during a termination meeting. He killed the labor relations supervisor who handled his termination, and he killed his direct boss. So I went to the prison in California where Mack was housed in March of '93, and I interviewed him about the incident, and that became the centerpiece for the book, Ticking Bombs. The book did fairly well as a new title on that subject, but it really didn't pick up much momentum until April of '99 when we had Columbine. And then after Columbine, we started to look at in this country the need for the things we're talking about today, which is threat assessment process, a response to active shooters, which we have more kind of fleshed out and more tactically sufficient today than ever before. Many of you in your work see the run, hide, fight video and have seen variations of active shooter videos, including shots fired and some of the other videos that have been done that are really changing to become the national protocol for how we not only assess threat but teach people, especially at the frontline employee level or kids in schools, how to respond and stay safe in active shooter situations, as rare as they are. So as Johnny had mentioned, we do have a concern in this country about how we statistically categorize active shooters. Some criminologists say the problem is not that severe. The FBI says it's more severe. There's lots of ways of looking at the statistics, and I think when we're talking about human beings and safety and the lives of people we care about at schools and work, I don't care what the statistics say. I care about interrupting the opportunity and stopping the problem. The most recent incident we have, of course, is the Colorado shooting involving the perpetrator who attempted to target one of his teachers and ended up shooting and severely wounding a girl at the school before taking his own life. I always feel bad for Colorado. As an entity, as a state, I feel like they're sort of unfairly connected to the subject because of Columbine, but also think about some other things that have happened there, like John Benet Ramsey was killed in Jefferson County, which is in the same county as Columbine. And there have been other incidents around the Denver area which sort of connect to workplace violence and school violence, and so I feel bad for the folks in Colorado that they seem to be a focal point for some of these cases. My work in this area is really divided amongst school violence prevention and workplace violence prevention, and I know that many of you have a sense of success with this issue is really around the idea of threat assessment teams. And if I had to look at the biggest contribution I have made in the 20 years of doing this work, it's really in the idea of how we orient school districts or schools or private sector employers or public sector employees into the creation and staffing and utilization of a threat assessment team. We're all smart folks, but I think when we get together as a group and we bring our respective strengths in terms of skill sets and expertise and knowledge together into a room, in 45 minutes to 1 hour we can come up with a great response to a situation involving an active threat to our organization or our employees or our kids in a pretty short period of time. The threat assessment team process, to me, says that we don't all have to be experts in law enforcement or HR or security or mental health, but we can bring people from those respective professions into our organization and say, what do we collectively do? And over a short period of time, we're able to come up with a safety plan, a security plan, which is quite beneficial to the people that are involved in these situations. So I want to talk about the threat assessment process. I want to do it in a different kind of a light. How do we do threat assessment if we cannot interview the subject of making the threats? Or do we need to make good choices as to whether or not we do, in fact, interview somebody when it comes to making a threat? The reason for this discussion, and I appreciate Johnny's involvement in this, is really driven for me by an incident that I worked on last year, where the subject in question who was making the threats was a college professor. And those of you that work in or around academic environments know that short of some sexual inappropriate contact with a student or a child, it's pretty difficult to get rid of tenured teachers, tenured professors, teachers that have a fair degree of union representation and a lot of protections in terms of their employment. So we have here in this community college a professor who is quite erratic in his behavior. There's some deep bipolar, manic episodes going on, followed by severe depression. Very entitled guy in terms of his interactions with other people, quite suspicious, a lot of high degree of paranoia, where he would see that anything that the organization tried to do in terms of correcting or influencing or improving his performance in the classroom or performance in meetings and conversations with peers and his bosses was a direct insult to his authority. So they asked me to take a look at this gentleman in the context of his work and to see what I thought about whether or not he was potentially violent to the organization. He had a pretty deep backstory. He came from another country. There was a degree of bravado and sort of overarching menace and threat into his threats to other people. There felt quite concerned based on interactions with him where he would fly off the handle at the smallest provocation and really be kind of a scary guy. So my involvement in the case was to look at all of his emails to the various department peers and to his department head and the deans and things like that, to look at his writings that he would send to other people through correspondence, and then also to look at him personally in his behavior in a staff meeting. So I came into a meeting as a unidentified consultant. They were talking about furniture and how to orient this new hall that they were going to move into, and I just watched him for about an hour in the meeting. And during that time, he was abrasive and obnoxious and impolite and just pounding on the table and sort of broad shoutings, and everything was sort of divined around the idea that the whole thing was a conspiracy to screw him out of success in his job. So based on my review of his written work, I interviewed everybody that was around him that felt afraid and really tried to categorize why they felt afraid. And then me seeing him in the context of this staff meeting, I was able to write a report about my sense of him in terms of threat assessment. Now, it's important for us to think about the idea of threat assessment as not predicting violence, as you know, but also assessing dangerousness. So we don't predict violence and cannot, but we certainly can assess dangerousness. And I had my concerns about this person's off-the-job issues. He had suicidal ideations. He had a difficult romantic relationship that he was involved in. There were a lot of issues going on with him, and I had significant concerns about how they were going to discipline and ultimately terminate this employee, which they did. So we worked through a whole plan as to how to do that. But the impetus for that conversation that we're having today was when I met with one of his colleagues who was a psychologist. And I'm not a psychologist. My doctorate's in business administration. I have a master's in security. I have a BS in psychology and a BA in English. So I know enough about psychology to be dangerous, but I'm not a clinician. I'm not a licensed clinician. The clinician said to me, the woman who I was meeting with, how can you possibly do a threat assessment on somebody you don't meet with? And I said, I don't always have the luxury of meeting with these people. Sometimes they're no longer around the organization. Sometimes they refuse to meet, or thanks to the internet, they've done a fair amount of due diligence research on me, and they know what I'm all about before I even come in the room, and they won't say anything that contributes to the conversation. So that was sort of the impetus for this discussion, which is how do you do a threat assessment if you don't interview the subject? And do we have some choices, positively or negatively, as to whether or not we should interview the subject? And does it make it worse when we do, or does it help? So moving from the title page, here you can see all these cool initials after my name: PHR, Professional in Human Resources, CPP, Certified Protection Professional, or as we like to call it, Certified Paid Paranoid, and then Board Certified Coach. So I'm certified in coaching, HR, and security, and I think those are useful and reasonable skill sets to bring to the threat assessment conversation. If you want to copy the slides after this is over, please send me an email. I'll send them over to you. And if you want to get in touch with me, feel free, or get in touch with me through Johnny in his office. That would be great as well. So Yoda, our threat assessment friend here, talks about do or do not. There is no try. And I think we use him as a model to say, do we have an opportunity to advance our knowledge of a subject? If we interview this person, then I think you ought to do it. If you have a choice between interviewing or not interviewing a subject for a threat assessment, I think you take the choice to interview the person. But I think also you should not do it if it escalates the situation. It puts the victims in more immediate harm, as we might see in a domestic violence or a stalking situation, or it escalates the person's behavior into realizing that maybe time is running out and they have no choice but to act out. So we'll talk about that as we go forward. For me, if we go back to the idea that we are assessing dangerousness and not predicting violence, the four centerpiece parts of threat assessment are information, intuition, experience, and then our ability to communicate as a threat assessment team or to communicate with our peers, colleagues, people that are stakeholders in safety and security in the organization. One of the challenges that we face in threat assessment is, in a perfect company, there would be an HR director, a security director, there would be legal, there would be access to an employee assistance program coordinator, there might be a mental health clinician who is on site or on staff, or there would be facilities people that could help us with the security part of it, etc. In the real world, you may work with organizations as an internal provider or as an external consultant where there are no security directors. Somebody who is in HR wears many hats. There may be no employee assistance program, and if they have one, it's at an arm's length. And we're really tasked with how we do threat assessment using the folks that we have in the room rather than the ones that we want to have in the room. So, in other words, not every organization has a security manager, a security director, even security guards. Not every organization has a company attorney on staff. Not every organization has facilities people on staff. A lot of folks wear different hats in the organizations that you may go into. We have to do the best in terms of the team communication process with who we have. I think your experience in threat assessment is valuable, whether it comes from public sector work or private sector work, whether it comes from a military background, whether you have a background in the law or human resources or as a clinician, whether you have a background in security. I mean, all these things bring together your ability to look at a situation not only from what you see and hear, but perhaps what you read between the lines, and what you see or hear is more overt, but also what you assess that may be more covert. I think intuition is a valuable tool for threat assessment, but I think it has to be tempered a little bit with the idea that intuition sometimes can put you in the wrong direction to either think too much that the person is not going to be dangerous or dismiss some of their concerns as maybe overreaction on your part. The reason I say that is sometimes in my cases, and this may happen to you, people will call me and they're absolutely in a panic. And I can sometimes pick up some of their energy when I assess the situation as being more dire than it actually is. And a perfect example in our work would be a bomb threat. And so we look at a bomb threat that just happened at Harvard the last couple of days. So somebody didn't want to take their final exams, and if I was at Harvard, I don't think I'd want to take the final exams there either. If you look at an overreaction based on you empathizing a bit too much with the person who's telling you the story, it can get in the way of your intuition. We know that bomb threats tend not to be followed by bombs in the United States, and that bomb threats are made by howlers, whereas hunters are the ones that do real bombings. Sometimes your intuition can be clouded by the energy of the person you're talking to about the case. It is possible, in the other perspective, to say, maybe I'm underreacting when I think about the situation because it sounds like not that big of a deal, and those will turn out to actually be quite a big deal. I'm thinking about cases where the perpetrator is not exactly forthright in his or her threats. They tend to do things by stealth. There tends to be more of a sense of a hidden message. They may not want to be overtly provocative, but they're provocative nonetheless, and sometimes we may miss some of the signals. And the most powerful pillar to me is our ability to gather as much information as necessary and as possible, including things like gossip. I use gossip in my cases all the time. I think about gossip as another piece of information that may be actually true. So if somebody says to me, I think the guy's wife is leaving him, I think the guy's wife, is going to move out tomorrow, that's significant information for me, even if it may not be provable and could be gossip. I take all information. Sources of the past in terms of paper trails and personnel files and emails and things like that, on up to communications this person may have made with coworkers, family, friends, strangers, colleagues, students, etc. So my approach to threat assessment is probably similar to yours, which is all information is good information as long as I can verify it, and even if I can't, it may still be valuable. So your intuition matched with your experience, your educational background, your ability to work in teams to extract the right path, the right strategy from the folks in the room, and the information that you have as much as possible can be quite valuable in these situations. If you talk to the perpetrator, it can be very useful, the person making the threats. If you don't, then we go on what we have in front of us. So let's go back to sort of the basics here. Why couldn't you interview the subject of a threat? Why wouldn't you be able to? Well, this happens a lot in my cases, and yours too. The employee leaves. They're now an ex-employee. They've quit or they've been terminated. Their contact with the organization may continue through cyber, through phone calls, through driving by, through boundary probing behavior in the parking lot, through attempting to get into the facility, but they're an ex-employee. They have no duty or cause to meet with you in any kind of context unless you can convince them to do so. If they're an ex-employee, you certainly can't hold, I'm going to fire you, or you're insubordinate if you don't meet with us. If it is an employee, sometimes management is fearful of any escalation, so they don't want you to antagonize this person. They don't think you have good interview skills, and you're going to make things worse. This leads to me to think about the dead elephant in the parlor question, which is oftentimes related to guns. I will come into an organization who the employee is suspected of bringing a gun to work, and once I meet with the employee, that's one of the first questions I ask. Do you have a gun? Do you bring it to work? Do you have it with you now? Where is it? And sometimes people are fearful in management that if you say or do something that addresses the presenting issue, you're going to make it worse. Well, my argument is the whole time the person is sitting there, they're going to think and wonder when you're going to ask them about the gun. I like to get it out on the table pretty quickly. How about the employee refuses to meet with you, and through union issues or through they have an attorney or the organization's HR cannot enforce a meeting where the employee has to sit with you, and they won't. So sometimes we have the union, or they have company attorneys, or the employee has an attorney which won't allow a conversation with you. If it's a cyber case, it may be anonymous behavior involving an employee who is sending sending emails and texts and things like that from an anonymous account. It may be somebody using social media in an inappropriate way where you don't necessarily know who it is. Or if you do know who it is, it could be an ex-employee. And again, we have the same issue, which is there is no duty for them to talk to you if they're no longer working there. Parenthetically, I do like working on cyber cases for a couple reasons. One, the data that is given to me in a cyber case is very specific. Date and time, you can track the content and flow and sort of anger in the email. You can look and see whether this person is sending a different one every 5 minutes at 2 o'clock in the morning. Do they send one a month, or do they send 300 a day? I think you can get a sense of bipolar disorder, disconnected thinking, out of touch with reality. I think you can get a sense of homicidal ideation versus suicidal ideation. So I like working on cyber cases because sometimes the stress of meeting with the person actually raises my own stress level. Looking at their emails, I can think clearly and calmly as to what my next steps are in terms of engaging with them. And lastly, in a domestic violence or stalking case, and Johnny knows this a lot from his work, the victim employee may fear retaliation if you meet with, let's say, an employee who is in a dating relationship, or you have the ability to meet with somebody who is off the job who may be targeting a victim employee at work, there's a real big and valid sense of concern for his or her safety and retaliation. Everybody knows if I can't have you, nobody else can is a significant warning sign for domestic violence homicide in our country. So those are some of the reasons why we typically cannot interview the subject. And if we do actually get in face-to-face with the subject, they may be very fearful of what you say or do that will lead to their termination, or what you say or do for them or to them will lead to them being arrested or detained by the police for a mental health investigation. They may bring a union rep into the room for what are called a Weingarten meeting. And a Weingarten meeting has to do with whether or not the employee believes that it's related to discipline. They may have an attorney in the room who interrupts or does not allow the person to answer the questions. And if you've watched 60 Minutes, you see this happen a lot where somebody who is being investigated brings their attorney and they constantly interrupt. One of the things that I face, and this is a blessing and a curse for being a lot on the internet in terms of my blogs, my books, my articles and presentations and things like that, is that if the person meeting with you does a little bit of research, they can find out a lot about what you're all about fairly quickly. So I try to have generic business cards that just say Steve Albrecht, HR consultant, because if sometimes I give my business card to somebody and I meet with them over a span of time, they may do a lot of research about me to figure out what I'm all about on the threat assessment side. So let's say they keep rescheduling the meeting, they make threats during the meeting, they're provocative or overt or covert threats, they're defiant, they're obviously lying to, or they're visibly mentally ill, either manic or out of touch with reality. These can make the interviews quite difficult. And in fact, it's almost impossible to get good information if we have the last two bullet points are in play. I don't know what to do about a lot of these because we ask the HR people to tell the union folks, the union reps, and the attorneys not to interrupt. I don't know how to keep somebody from doing research about you. If they put Johnny Lee's name into the internet, they find a lot of cool stuff about what he's all about. So these are handicaps that we face in our work in terms of people making a value judgment that we're there to fire them, we're there to think that they're crazy, we're there to think that they're violent, we're there to ruin their life in some way. So one of the conversations that comes up a lot in my work is when should we interview versus when should we not? And if we have the choice, again, I think you do interview the subject. The more information you get, you can verify. You can put them on notice that their behavior has been identified as being inappropriate or dangerous. It allows the person to tell their story in a contextual way for them, which you can measure and verify and analyze or discount based on what you know before you go in the room. Most investigative processes, and I'm sure you do it similar to I do, is I will talk to everybody involved in a threat assessment situation. Victim employees, witness employees, other students, teachers, HR director, security director, people that have had interactions with this employee or with this student, and then of course the last person we talk to is the actual target themselves, the actual subject of the threats. So we may talk to the targets, the witnesses, the people on the periphery, supervisors, teachers, etc. But the last person we talk to is the subject of making the threats, and therefore we can verify what they have said in their discussion with what we already know. And the last one I think is significant because in some of the cases that you work on, as I do too, these folks need boundaries. And one of the ways you get boundaries for them is to say, you can't keep doing this. It puts your job at risk. It puts your freedom at risk. It's not appropriate for you to say or do these things. And this is especially useful in low-level situations where the employee makes a threat or a student makes a threat to harm people. And their defense later on is, I was just kidding, or I was blowing off steam, or I was really angry at the time. I typically say, I get that. We all go through situations where we say things we regret. I'm just telling you the organization's putting you on notice now that this is the last time this kind of behavior is going to be tolerated, and you're going to put your job at risk and let you stop. In a perfect world, those folks are remorseful. They apologize. They're fearful of the process where they could actually be fired, and I don't often see repeated behavior of the same thing. The guy that scares me in my work, and maybe scares you too, is the guy that says, yeah, I said it, what are you going to do about it? And folds his arms and sort of leans back, and I go, huh, okay, let's talk about what that all means, because I want to see remorse, I want to see apologies, I want to see, I don't want to do that because I don't want to put my job or my freedom at risk. So if we have a choice and we are interviewing subjects, if we're given that opportunity, these are the things that are the pros in terms of pros and cons of interviewing a subject of a threat. So here's the language I typically use, and I'm guessing you do too. Again, if you look at the bottom, I try to get to the dead elephant in the room question: guns, intentions, and as the Secret Service has taught us, is the person on a path from ideas to actions? Have they bought a gun, practiced with a gun, thought about bringing a gun to work, brought a gun to work? Have they made any life-changing movements in terms of, selling all their clothes and giving away their stuff and writing out a will and all the things that you may be able to determine in a conversation? And if you can't determine it in a conversation with the person, you can maybe pick up some of that behavior in the best part of our job for threat assessment, which is third-party leakage. And if you look at third-party leakage as this person not telling the target they're going to do something harmful, but telling friends or coworkers or colleagues or other students, that's oftentimes where we get our most valuable information. I always like to ask the question, and if you're under 30, it probably doesn't make sense to you. Before he shot President Reagan, who did John Hinckley tell he was going to shoot President Reagan? Who did he call 3 times to say, I'm going to shoot the president for you? And for those of you under 30, you can Google this if you need to. It's Jodie Foster, the actress. When Jodie Foster was at Yale, John Hinckley called her 3 times and said, I'm going to shoot the president for you. So this third-party leakage oftentimes helps us verify when we have a conversation with the target, or the subject, whether or not we should have significant concerns. So you can say to this person, this gives you a chance to clear the air. It gives me a chance to hear your side of the story. You can tell me about your cause or your demand or the reason you're so upset. What do you want from the organization? What do you want from the school? Why are you making these kinds of comments or doing these types of things? And that's where you can, as an assessor, sort of sit there passively and say, huh, interesting, tell me more. And then what happened? And then what will happen if we do this or we don't do that? And then also I want to find out what level of remorse we see in these cases. Are they sad about what they said they were going to do? Or are they fearful about the consequences for their behavior, or do they not care? I hope that makes sense. So if we talked just a couple of seconds ago about the pros of interviewing somebody, there are certainly some cons as well, and some risk factors towards interviewing subjects of threats which are significant. One of the biggest ones is once you come in and meet with a subject who has made threats, they see that the consequences are more severe, time is running out, there's no other hope, they become more suicidal or more depressed or even homicidal. They have a sense that in a domestic violence situation, if they attempt to attack the target, there will be more barriers put in place. They'll transfer the other employee. They'll move the employee out of the building. They'll put them in another facility. They'll send them away, and time is running out. So these are valid concerns. I think one of the problems is, given a choice between interviewing versus not interviewing, sometimes if we can do a lot of our work behind the scenes and we don't interview the subject, we can actually get a pretty good plan together without having to confront this person into taking some kind of lethal action. Again, I said, given my choice of interviewing versus not interviewing, I'm usually going to choose interviewing unless I really feel like, from our perspective, and we talk about this as a group, that any intervention from a consultant or security person or HR person would really escalate this person's behavior and make things automatically worse. Then we're looking at, do the police need to get involved right away? If I look at this person's background and backstory and comments, do I see suicidal, homicidal ideations that are really quite noticeable? Do I see, switching from a mania perspective to a depression perspective? Do I see a sense that they have no hope, they're not talking about the future, they're being quite focused on murder-suicide type of solution? Do they feel like we are going to interfere with their grand plan through the police, through HR, through security, through an involuntary mental health commitment? These types of cases can escalate when we send the employee for a fitness for duty evaluation, or when we send the employee to a recommended but not necessarily mandated employee assistance program counseling, because we can't force them to go to EAP like we can force them to go to a fitness for duty violation. But for me, in situations where people feel like they're running out of hope, it's a concern. Johnny?
Oh, thank you. You might have heard me. You may have this on your next slide, but just a little about safety. If there's an augmented chance of aggression or hostility, anything you do to arrange for safety during these interviews?
That's a great question. I like to use a neutral office, maybe one that's not necessarily in the human resources department. I use maybe a conference room that it just has padded chairs and nothing on the table that could be used as a weapon. In some situations, I may ask, if it's really high risk, I may ask if I'm in another city, I may ask the police department to send over a female investigator or a female patrol cop wearing a business suit. Many perpetrators do not believe that cops are women, and so if I bring over a guy in a business suit who looks like a cop, with the short haircut and the mustache and all that, like I have, it's too obvious. So sometimes I'll bring over a female, either an investigator or a private investigator, or someone who is a security expert who could be who could be female, and they'll lower the emotional temperature. I introduce this person as an HR consultant, and they can watch the safety and security of the proceedings. But that's a great question.
Thank you.
So let's switch over back to a little bit of threat assessment basics here, where we look at what we're up against. And a lot of this material comes from one of my colleagues in the threat assessment world, which is Reed Malloy. Reed is a well-known psychologist in San Diego. Just came out with a new book, I think, getting ready to break here fairly soon. And Reed's meticulous research and really focus on threat assessment, especially not only national cases but international cases, is very well known. Those of you that have some knowledge of the group I belong to, ATAP, the Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, will know Reed's work pretty substantially. But the thing that I really look at in terms of what Reed's talking about, what the Secret Service talks about, what the FBI has given us, what the U.S. Marshals have given us in terms of not profile behaviors, but characteristic, not profiles, but behavior characteristics. And we're away from this profile thinking, white males that own firearms and used to be in the military is not useful for us, but some of these behavioral issues. So the biggest one that jumps out at me certainly is this leakage of third-party threats. So if we don't talk to the person making the threats, the perpetrator themselves, we do get sometimes a lot of background data from students, colleagues, parents, coworkers, family, friends, supervisors, HR, security people that say, hey, the guy said or did these things, but he didn't do it to the target. He was angry at his boss, but he didn't tell his boss. He was angry at the principal, but he didn't tell the principal. He told these other folks. And the leakage of third-party threats in our work, I think, is one of the most significant intervention techniques that we can really help with, and how we get that data is significant, whether it's anonymous tip lines or social media or confidential conversations with employees or students. I think it's important to get that. But look at Malloy's process here, which is similar to other sort of paths from ideas to actions that we've seen in the Secret Service, and also in the work that's done by Steve Weston and Ted Calhoun. They're on a path to violence, preparation, planning. You've got an escape plan. They have a suicide plan. Many of these guys have suicide plans, as we know. They're fixated on the target, ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend, teacher, boss, coworker. And the sad reality of a lot of these cases is, and we've seen this, sometimes these perpetrators will come onto the property or come on campus. They'll shoot one person. They'll let somebody else go. They certainly have a targeted list inside their head. Malloy talks about the commando warrior mentality, which is these guys are dressing in black and camouflage, and they've got tactical vests on, bulletproof vests, and night scopes, and night vision goggles, and all the stuff they get off of watching these, video games and Rambo-type movies where, the perpetrator in the movies is dressed in these costumes, and that's what they call it. They come out from behind sort of this loner, hidden away perspective into this energy burst. They've been off the radar screen socially and publicly, and so they burst out, and that's when their big event happens. They do testing of a firearm. They drive by the facility, drive by the school. They try to get onto the campus after they've been expelled or kicked out. They try to get into the facility after they've been fired. They try to get into the facility using ID cards that have expired, things like that. And then the last resort thinking, which is, I have to do this. There are no other options. This is the path I have chosen. We typically see this in their post-incident writings, where they'll oftentimes leave these manifestos and things like that. Malloy's work in this area has really identified some significant things. One is, upon autopsy, when we cut these guys open after they kill themselves or they are killed by the police, we find no evidence of drug or alcohol use, no evidence of psychotropic medication, no evidence of impairment through substances that you would think you and I would need to be able to kill a bunch of kids or kill another person. Why? Because they want to be sharp, they want to be focused, they want to put their plan, which they've been thinking about from 3 months to 1 year to several years, into operation.
Hey, Steve, can I interrupt real quick?
Sure.
I totally derailing the topic, but yeah, I'd love to have maybe another webinar. I just posted this interesting long discussion on LinkedIn about antidepressants. Now, you talked about alcohol, substances, illegal substances, but it's really interesting looking at the number of these individuals who are on, antidepressants. Didn't want to interrupt, but I just thought that was an interesting note.
Yeah, what I noticed too is that there'll be some compliance for some part with their antidepressant medications, anti-anxiety medications. Some of these are pretty heavy duty. They're taking lithium and things like this, and then they're going to go off these medications in order to be more focused and more clear because they don't want the side effects and they want to be able to carry out their plan. So,
great point.
It's a great question you bring up, which is how do we get a sense in some of these third-party leakage conversations about compliance with medication? I've stopped taking my meds, I've switched over to beer, is going to be a bad sign.
Absolutely. And then there's all these HIPAA regulations about documenting your knowledge about their medications or diagnosis. It's really complex.
And my thing is HIPAA and FERPA and all that get trumped by threat assessment. I think we have an active threat. We say we're going to break HIPAA and FERPA laws to protect other people because I'd rather be sued for violating HIPAA and FERPA than wrongful death.
I'm glad.
Just a quick. Go ahead.
No, I'm glad to hear you say that.
Just a quick shout out to the folks at the Secret Service. If you've not read the report, The Exceptional Case Study Project, I commend it to your thinking. It is a Bible in my work. I think Johnny agrees that the work done by the Secret Service, not only in the Safe School Initiative, but the Exceptional Case Study Project, is really significant in our thinking in terms of how these people plan and prepare and share and move from ideas to actions. So you can get the Exceptional Case Study Project on the website, on their website. I think it's useful for your library if you don't already have it. Johnny, I'm guessing you would agree?
Absolutely. Thank you.
And we look at the work from Calhoun and Weston. They've done some stuff with CRC Press. I apologize for the graininess at the bottom. If you put Steve Weston, W-E-S-T-O-N, or Fred Calhoun, C-A-L-H-O-U-N, into Google, you'll pop out from some stuff that they have done for CRC Press. I think their books are really quite useful in the model that they espouse, which I agree with, that some people howl and some people hunt. And the good news is most of the people we deal with in threat assessment are howlers. The bad news is the people that want to harm people are the hunters, and oftentimes we don't discover them unless we pay attention to the warning signs until after their event has taken place. So if you look at hunters versus howlers in their work, they talk about this path from the grievance stage to the attack stage. It could happen over several years, several months, several weeks. It can be made worse by triggering events like broken marriage, financial problems, legal issues. It can be made more severe by discipline and termination in an office environment, being expelled, or significant problems on campus, bullying and things like that. The good news is that many things that we do along the way can knock these folks off the path from ideas to actions, even if we don't talk to them. Some of our work around the target, we can knock them on the path from ideas to actions if they think we're on to their plan. The bad news is we don't often know what works. So sometimes our efforts in these areas, we don't know what drove the person from attacking. A positive interview with you could be the switch that flips in their head that says, I was going to shoot these people, but I decided not to based on how I was treated. And it can be that simple. And so the hard part of our work is how do we prove success when nothing happens? Our reward for our work is sometimes we don't know. And I'd like to keep it that way. I wish it was an easier path to figure out what we need to do, but oftentimes the more things we try to knock them off this path from ideas to action, the better it's going to be, even if we don't interview the target, these subjects. So again, we're back to this behavior thinking. Do we see from what we know, if we cannot interview the person that's making the threats, we cannot interview the subject, do we get a sense of these issues? Are they troubled, meaning something's bothering them, versus troubling, they're bothering other people? Do we see anger turned inward, which is depression? Are they an injustice collector at work and at school, where they feel like the world is out to screw them, their professional reputation is constantly being attacked by bosses and coworkers that are trying to ruin their lives? Do we have a sense of stimulant drug use, alcohol use, as Shani mentioned, on or off compliance with medication? Do we have evidence that they are bullied, which is stronger to me than being a bully? Significant off-campus or off-the-job issues with no support. That's some work that came out from the Secret Service, said that a lot of these kids had no significant adult in their life, nobody, a coach, a parent, a step-parent, a grandfather, anybody that they could turn to in their lives. Do we have sense that they're moving from ideas to actions by buying a firearm, practicing with it? The Navy Yard shooting, the guy bought the gun several days before the incident and practiced with it, the shotgun. And the biggest one for me is really where I see people talking about using school violence or workplace violence as a solution to their life problems, or where they make a connection to a workplace or school perpetrator in a positive light, which is really quite disturbing. You know, that kid in Connecticut, he did what he had to do. You know, that guy at the Navy Yard, he took care of business. People don't disrespect him now. Those types of comments from employees are a significant warning sign for me. So again, even if you don't have the opportunity based on boundaries or barriers, or they won't comply in terms of interviewing the maker of the threats, the potential perpetrator, some of these things that we hear along the way in terms of the backstory from coworkers, from their own mouth, through somebody else, can be significant help in terms of the threat assessment process. So Calhoun and Weston's work in this area, I commend to your thinking as well. Howlers howl, hunters hunt. The idea of hunters engaging in stealth, their function is to harm people. Where we figure them out is oftentimes through this third-party leakage. Who they tell is not the direct target. That's howler behavior. And I get frustrated in our world how we spend so much time on howler antics. Bomb threats on airplanes, bomb threats at Harvard, people that write letters and threaten to come in with a bazooka and shoot up a school board meeting. But that's howler behavior. The folks that scare me are the ones who plan and scheme and plot, but don't do it in a way that draws a lot of attention to themselves. Those are the ones that concern me. So you think about the shooter in the Aurora, Colorado movie theater, hunter behavior. Lanza in Sandy Hook, hunter behavior. The perpetrator in the Navy Yard shooting, hunter behavior. Howlers draw a lot of attention to themselves for their behavior. Hunters work in stealth. Those are the folks we ought to be looking at. So when I'm thinking about whether or not we can intervene in these situations with perpetrators, am I getting an intuitive sense of howler behavior or hunter behavior? And certainly hunters is a bigger concern for me. Again, if you cannot actually interview the subject of making the threats, look at the totality of these inhibitors versus igniters and say, which ones do we see? Do we see appropriate religious beliefs? Do we see significant family connections? Do we see money in the bank? Do we see job security? Do we see appropriate friends and social and love relationships that are good support mechanisms for them? Or do we see a lot of the stuff on the right which says these people are moving from ideas to actions based on running out of hope? Economic stress, the desire for revenge, broken heart, not necessarily introverted behavior, because I'm an introvert, but loner behavior, which is more sinister. The idea of a one-dimensional life, I'm really focused on weapons or violent video games or this girl or my job, where they don't see anything outside the spectrum from what they're looking. And the last one is interference from who? It could be from you as an intervening consultant or threat assessor. It could be interference from HR, the police, security, their parents, a teacher. Somebody's going to screw up their grand plan to harm folks. And so sometimes interference is a way for them to step on the gas pedal and move faster down the path from ideas to actions. Paul Mullen is a psychologist in Australia. He talked about 3 risk factors for significance for violence. One is a history of substance abuse with the perpetrator. The other is a history of violence in the perpetrator, either domestic violence or child abuse or physical violence against other. And then the third one is previous sexual intimacy between the victim and the suspect. So one of the questions I ask in threat assessment, if I can't talk to the perpetrator, is what was your relationship with this person? And if I hear we just went on a couple coffee dates, I'm not as concerned as this used to be my boyfriend or this used to be my husband. Albrecht's Big Four are the 4 things I am significantly concerned about when I hear about perpetrator behavior, and they are minimize, deny, rationalize, and blame. Minimize means to make what they do smaller, meaning, yeah, I only hit the guy one time. I just bumped his car with my car a little bit. What's the big deal? So they make their actions smaller. Deny, they say they didn't do it. I wasn't there. He's lying. I didn't actually do that, right? Rationalize, we've heard all this, right? This place is stressful. He started it. She called me a name, et cetera, et cetera. And the last one is blaming, which is similar. You know, I was drunk at the time, or I knew this was going to happen based on how people treat me, et cetera, et cetera. So when I see the Big Four, instead of, I'm sorry, I wish it hadn't happened, I hope I don't lose my job or you don't kick me out of school, I'm significantly concerned. Minimize, deny, rationalize, blame. If you look at these indicators of higher risk, you can see the ones that jump out in terms of especially being out of touch with reality. History of drug and alcohol abuse can be a concern. Again, they may not be drunk or high at the time of their attack, but they use drugs or alcohol as a coping mechanism to excess. History of suicidal thoughts or using violence as part of their life solutions, and this idea of being an injustice collector where the world's out to screw me and I want to pay people back is a significant risk factor. Again, for the access disorders that you see at the top, antisocial personality disorder, or what we used to call psychopaths, is a concern. Borderline personality, which is the fatal attraction syndrome. Paranoid personality is a significant risk to me because everything we predict, or everything we do, they've already predicted. So the perpetrator may say, I bet you're going to call the cops, and we've already called the cops. I bet you're going to try to fire me, and we try to fire him. So sometimes paranoid people can be quite insightful as to what we're going to do because they've already predicted it. A couple models here, and then we'll start to wrap up and take some questions. Reed Malloy and Steve White have a model called Waiver 21. If you put it into Google, it'll pop up. They'll talk about their characteristics here, the 21 characteristics, and I have 10 here and another 10 coming up. Some of these we've talked about. So the questionnaire that they use, and they do it as part of a training program they provide. Do we see these things as absent in the perpetrator or the alleged future perpetrator or threatener? Are these things present or are they prominent? Now, prominent means we're seeing, you know, active behavior in this area. Present means it could be a concern, and absent means it's not a concern. So if you look at these 10 characteristics here, and then the next 11 I want to show you, this is the hallmark of their model. And White and Malloy, Steve White from Work Trauma Services and Reed Malloy are quite skilled in the collection of these types of characteristics, behavioral concerns for threat assessment. So you look at these 10 plus these 11 here. Again, are they absent? Do we see them present, or are they more severe in terms of being prominent? So this is not a commercial pitch for these guys. It's just new in terms of being out for the last couple of years. There's a lot of tools and instruments that may be useful. Waiver 21 could be something that you want to put into your toolkit. Sorry. The Association of Threat Assessment Professionals, ATAP, we have our own thing called RAGE-V, Risk Assessment Guidelines for Elements for Violence. Again, similar to Malloy and White. Do we identify some of these concerns here? Do we assess the person, the context, the co-workers, the witnesses, the other students, and then how we manage the process? So we look at the psychological variables, the legal variables, how much information we can gather. Do we look at the point of view of the target, the point of view of the perpetrator, the point of view of the organization or the school, the point of view of the witnesses? Do we look at some of the information about this person, historical information, employment information, backstory issues on a student, etc.? Look at things that are inhibitors to violence, triggers to violence, stabilizers in this person's life, appropriate, you know, family relationships, money in the bank, etc., and then look at their past violent behaviors. So ATAPworldwide.org is the website for that. ATAPworldwide.org is the ATAP website. We have 11 chapters around the United States, maybe one close to you. And when you think about joining up with a group like this, you can get some good verification as to what you're doing as best practices. For me, I have kind of a similar questionnaire that I use, which doesn't give a score or doesn't come up with a lot of complex kind of criteria. It just says, what do we know about any of these situations here? And I have 50 questions which I ask threat assessors to think about, which is how do we come up with answers to some of these things to fill in the gaps as to whether we should be more concerned or less concerned. And I'm happy to send you a copy of that. If you want to email me, just put TA, Threat Assessment Questionnaire, and I'll be happy to send it to you. So as much information you can get from every source could be quite useful in these situations. So our reward for being vigilant in our work is, guess what, more vigilance. So the way we prove that today was boring is tonight when we go home and nothing bad happened. So happy holidays to everybody if you want to sign off on the call, but if you have some questions, I'm happy to take them now. Johnny, back over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We did have a question about the models that you discussed. Just to read it verbatim, do you utilize tools such as the WVR21 in every assessment? If not, what criteria do you use to lead you to want to utilize a tool?
That's a great question. I think the answer as a good consultant is it depends. I use waiver as a jumping off point, as I might use any other questionnaire as a jumping off point. I think the more data we have, the better. Sometimes waiver can ask questions that I forgot about, and so I may use it as a way to sort of check that I'm asking the right kinds of questions. But I think if you look at, even if you don't go through the training for the model, if you look at the 21 characteristics of waiver and the ones that ATAP uses and the ones that I use, you can get a good sense of, you say, I need to ask those questions myself. I may have left that out in the last conversation. And especially when you're meeting with perpetrators, meeting with potential, violence perpetrators, these can be very stressful meetings. I like to have my notes in order and make sure that I ask the questions when I only have one chance, if I only have one chance with this person to ask the question, so I don't not get the answer, or at least to try at the answer before we wrap up. Johnny, back over to you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I had the mute button on. My mistake. There's more questions about the slide deck, the presentations, and I heard you say that you'd be willing to share it. They can contact you, or I'd be glad to send that out to Steve if save you that hassle.
Yeah, either way, I'm happy to provide the slides. And again, I'm not commercializing the models that are out there. I just think that they're all useful, and if we can get some value from everybody's stuff, because it's all kind of similar in terms of the questions we're asking, and it helps you in a stressful situation make sure you're going in the right direction.
Sure. But I love the questions more about, please continue the in-depth questions about the content, such as, what if the employee is not the problem, but it's a client, so sort of type 2 violence. We may not have access to the client's background, criminal records, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. I sometimes see organizations that are really stressed by customer or client behavior, call centers, people that deal with folks over the counter and face-to-face, especially during this time. I think you have to make a decision as to say, how do we demonstrate that we want to protect our employees from abusive behavior? I think we have to give employees some training in this area to say, it's okay to hang up on people that curse at you. It's okay to disengage from the guy at the front counter who's threatening. It's okay to bring over your boss and to put kind of high-risk customer service skills to use, because they're not allowed to trample on you, even though they're paying for your goods and services.
You sort of answered this before, but I have my own experience is sometimes working within the healthcare field, whether it's a hospital or a health provider, insurance provider. And the question going back to, you mentioned about HIPAA and medical records, I certainly wanted to know about, diagnosis, medication, stuff like that. And I heard you're very clear about safety is job one, but sometimes in that room we have attorneys or information protection specialists who are like really cagey about sharing that info.
I think in a perfect world for threat assessment, you'd have the attorneys in the room, and you could say, what are the guidelines we can discuss here, especially with the clinicians, how much information they certainly can't reveal about people that they're treating.
Right.
One of the things I ask the attorneys to do is, look, keep all the notes. So we're all going to have a group discussion about this situation here. If you made notes, give them to the attorney in the room. He or she keeps it as part of attorney work privilege, so it's not subject to subpoena. And also that they can kind of give us some guidelines as to whether we're in sort of dicey territory. Oftentimes in HIPAA issues, I'm going off what the person who we are worried about has already revealed. So in my perspective, if they revealed their medication use, if they revealed their mental health history, it's different than us going into a file and opening it up and looking at it.
Absolutely. Another question, what process do you follow to return an employee to the workplace who has made suicidal ideations? And I just want to throw in, you mentioned I like stats. I'm horrified at the number of suicides at work compared to, let's say, homicides. It's staggering. So, yeah, we have an employee suicidal ideation. What's the process for getting them back to work?
I think it's a great question if you also incorporate the person who's made threats as well. So not only threats to self, but threats to others, because employees will say, he's crazy, I don't want to work with him. And I have to say to him, he's entitled to get his job back. We've gone through a process with him. We can't tell you what it is, but it's confidential, but we're comfortable that this person returns to work after whatever time they've been away. And I think you say to employees, look, you have the right to work in a safe environment. I want you to tell us if that's not happening. But we also have the right to give this person their job back and respect their privacy. So it is a definite transition conversation, which sometimes I do in a staff meeting to say, so-and-so is coming back to work. Our function is to provide a private, safe and comfortable environment for you and also for this person. Don't say stuff like, cover me, I'm going for coffee.
Excellent. Hey, we got a minute to go. I don't see any more questions. I've got a ton. Okay, this is you mentioned this earlier, and this is something I've always wanted to ask you. Earlier, you talked about the active shooter response videos. And in our field, there's so much, like almost a burgeoning industry on active shooter response, training kids on like putting up tables as shields and how to grab a gun from someone. I'm a little concerned that I see a lot of attention about this immediate response to the actual violence as opposed to the work you just been talking about prevention, identifying things and determining risk. Any thoughts about how this field is going?
I share your concerns. I see people in the school environment say we need to teach little kids how to fight back, and I disagree. I think under stress, the biggest value is to say, let's get these kids out of here, which is the run part, evacuation. Let's get them hide, which is the shelter in place, and find a safe room to lock down with the teachers and the other administrators, and leave the fighting to the cops. I think for adults, run, hide, fight is a good model. For kids, I think it's run and hide and let the cops do the fighting. So I'm not a huge fan of, of trying to make kids sort of into little warriors because it just makes them afraid to come to school.
Right. And it's my big belief, if I've got 20 minutes in front of a kid, I'm going to talk to them about trusting an authority, trusting to come forward and listening to their gut, getting them to speak up.
And being courageous enough not to fall into the no snitch, no rat culture, which everybody comes off and tells you later, oh, I knew this kid was going to do this. And I said, well, when did you know that? Oh, months before, and we have all failed. Yeah, yeah. Oh, a follow-up question about the suicide ideation. Is there a requirement for FFD? In terms of assessing somebody through fitness for duty to allow them to come back to work? Is that what the question is? I suppose so. Yeah, I would think if you had somebody that had suicidal ideations, which were not just, sort of joking around or a little blue one day, that a fitness for duty evaluation would be a requirement. At least I think the attorneys would ask for it and not only HR. Yes. Absolutely. I could stay here all day. I want to respect people's time and your time, of course. We're at the top of the hour mark. I don't know if there's any final things you wanted to say before I wrap it up. Just happy holidays, everybody, and keep on doing good work. And the team process is where we're all benefiting from each other's experience. And thanks to you, Johnny, for the forum today. Absolutely. Thank you so much. I really want to do this again. I've had a wonderful experience. I'll talk to you in just a minute, but I want to thank everyone else for joining us and stay safe. And I'm seeing a lot of thank yous and great presentations in the comments area, so you're welcome, everyone. Excellent, great. Well, everyone have a great, safe day. Take care, Steve. Thanks a lot, Johnny. You bet. Bye-bye.